All right, big red lights on. So I'm Jeff. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. If I'm not on a computer, I'm probably on a bike. You can find me online on Drupal.org. I'm Gapple. Twitter, I'm GappleCat. Either of those usernames elsewhere too, but those are probably the easiest places to find me. So kind of the main topics that I'll go over today, starting with just some of the capabilities that Google Analytics has, just as a high-level overview, some of the use cases that I've used implementing it, the module that I built and make use of for Drupal 8 to actually kind of make use of a bunch of those features, some examples of programming those features, both kind of within Drupal on the back-end side as well as some front-end capabilities for tracking more interactive items. And then after that, kind of the end result. Once you track all this information, what sort of reports can you get out of it and to be able to make use of it and hopefully gather some valuable insights. So if you go to the documentation, Google Analytics tells you this is the alternative snippet, but it's the better one to use unless you're cursed with having to support Internet Explorer 9. And it does a very basic thing. All it does is you tell it, your API key or your property key, and then track the page view. That logs quite a bit of information. It's got the user's IP address, a bunch of information about their browser, what device they're on. Gives you some performance information. So it's quite comprehensive out of the box in many ways. But the only thing that's really unique to your site that it tracks is the URL of the page they're on and the page title. So if you're trying to get more granular information, that can be pretty difficult. A couple of the use cases that I've worked on, this is a product website. Most of the content was categorized by category, subcategory. Product was kind of the main thing that they wanted people to see and interact with. And each of them had some associated assets. White papers had a form that you needed to fill out in order to be able to download it. Case studies were just, a sort of a viewable content page. And then brochures usually linked to a PDF. So they wanted to know how many people are viewing this page, how many people are downloading some of these assets or interacting with it. And the structure of this site was a little bit unique because each of these was a node. It didn't use taxonomy for this categorization. So pulling out that information was a little bit different. Another website that I worked on was for a media company. The majority of the content was based around a show, and the primary thing that people interacted with was media on the website, and some sort of targeted relevant information for that was what season, what year did this episode come out, or kind of numeric season for more periodic things, what episode was it, and then they had associated pages like, what are the hosts of this talk show program, or but then there was also some pages that were just generic, like about our company. So these had to be categorized differently to be able to see who's watching what shows, in what ways, or just kind of viewing these generic pages. And then the other project I worked on was, the entire site was 4 pages. This was for tracking the progress of Drupal 8, like how many issues were remaining, when do we think it's going to be done and coming out. So there wasn't a lot of page-based content here, so that page view wasn't particularly helpful, but it had these big interactive charts that made use of an API to load a bunch of data and then render it out. So there was some questions about, how much are people interacting with these charts, making use of it, as well as with all of the data that needs to be represented, how performant is it? So that gets into the first kind of capability that allows you to be a little bit more targeted about what you're pulling out of your site, and those are dimensions and metrics. Dimensions are basically metadata that describe things. So for the media, it's what season is this episode that this media page or video relates to, or what category on the site. Anything that you want to kind of break down or segment information. In many cases, like that product site was pretty good about its URLs, so you could infer from a URL what product it was around, what category it was, but then you have to do a whole lot of parsing after the fact, and to hand off a report to a director of a product category, you export it to a Excel spreadsheet, filter out the information that's relevant to them, and then they get that information and have to infer a bunch of other things. Whereas if you're tracking custom dimensions, you can set up reports that out of the box send that person a link, and they're only getting the information that's relevant to them, filtered by their category or explorable by those particular terms. And for someone non-technical or not working with Excel, they don't have to do any sort of URL parsing. In other cases, for the media website, their URLs didn't encapsulate some of that information. Like, you couldn't tell what season an episode was from based on the URL. So this, you can inject additional information to describe your content. Or another example for that media website is actually multilingual. The Canadian website is available in both French and English under completely different domains. So if you wanted to know how many people were viewing each language for the site, you could track that as a dimension separately and pull that out in reports, whereas you wouldn't be able to determine that from the URL. Metrics are things basically that you want to do math to. Either you want to count to do a sum, or as more common is you want to have an average metric. So there's some kind of built-in ones. A page view is an implicit metric of 1. So when you do math on that, when someone has a session on your website, they're browsing around for 30 minutes, what is the average number of pages that anyone on the site interacts with? So you want to count those up and do an average or something like that. Another one, there's plugins for e-commerce, so that you can say, like, what's the average price in someone's cart? That's kind of the biggest way to make use of it. One of the interesting ones that I saw is that there's a plugin that allows you to do how far people have scrolled down the page. So you can do a binary, has someone like read to the end of the article or not. But if you have a big, long, single-page website, to see how many people, like how much people are viewing of that, is you can track a metric of what's the farthest that anyone had, like that an individual user has scrolled down to that page, and then you can do an average of like how much of this page are people actually reading through, to know that maybe something isn't engaging. Why are people ending at certain points? And if you're trying to optimize something, is that metric improving over time? Is really important. So dimensions apply to a couple things. The most common one that I've done is a hit level scope. So that's something describing the page itself. So those are, this is the category, this is the season of this media. Another one is session information. So one of the kind of like built-in Google Analytics ones is an example for that, is where did someone visit the site from? Was it from social media, a organic search link, a paid search link, a direct visit? That information is still relevant 6 pages down the line, whether they go to a cart or add a product or not. It's still relevant, like, did they come from an ad campaign or not? So sessions allow you to apply dimensions that kind of track the user through their entire interaction over a period on the website. And then there's user ones as well. I haven't made use of these, but that's another category to, as soon as you know some information on a user and you want to apply it to all of their visits to the site, you can track this dimension and categorize the rest of their interactions, all of the page views and hits that they make on the website based on that property. So dimensions, metrics typically are set server side. There's something inherent to your content or the visitors on your website that you know about. Events are typically more interactive. They don't have to be, but this is things like, did someone hit a play button on a video? Or you have a carousel on your website and you want to prove that no one's clicking through to actually view the 4th item. You can actually trigger an event to say, what are people doing interacting with this carousel? How often are they doing it? And what's the drop-off for each slide? Usually it's interactive components. It could be things that happen server-side. So, for example, I've seen someone who's done it with a web form where they wanted to track an event, separate from just have they viewed the web form complete page, is it actually tracks, did they press the submit button on this form? Bit of a semantic difference, but it allowed them to kind of record and infer information a little bit differently. One of the helpful things So, as I mentioned, out of the box, Google Analytics tracks a bunch of page view type performance information, and it's fairly comprehensive. So that includes like how long did it take for the server to respond to the request. So you can determine, is my varnish cache working or not, or is this going all the way going through the entire render layer of Drupal and being really slow. And then as well, there's the front end performance. How long does it take for the page to actually render? The user is getting the page in half a second, but it's taking 5 seconds for the browser to actually make it visible and usable. But for kind of more meaningful interactions for your website, for that kind of issue tracking chart that I was doing, it's calling out to an API to pull back information in quite a few data points. So it's how long is this API taking to respond to my information? Am I requesting too much of it and it's starting to get slower? And then as well, rendering out all that information. If this chart is starting to take 10 seconds for someone to see, are they likely to bounce and not want to interact with it? Or is it performant enough that they're going to continue to do new items? These as well, I've usually done them as interactive things, so it's something in the browser that they're interacting with, but you could possibly track these server-side to say, to render out a page, I'm having to call out to an API or doing some sort of task or process. So you can embed these as well to get insights along with all of your other website information of how performant different components of your website are being over time. And then as well, there's a few plugins. The first two ones are built into Google Analytics. You don't have to tell it to load any other JavaScript URLs. So on that media website, they had two completely separate web domains for their French and English websites. But if a user was to bounce between them, Google Analytics would treat them as two entirely different users and had no idea that they were related. So the linker plugin modifies any of the links on your website so that when they click through from one of those websites to the other, it goes, oh, I know this is the same user. I can track them kind of collectively, and then later you can filter it out by this user is viewing the site in English or French, as opposed to having completely separate analytics for each website or seeing double the amount of users. In this case, pretty rare that users would bounce between the two sites like that, but depending on your use case, that might be an instance. One thing is it's not necessary if you're just doing a bunch of subdomains. By default, the Google Analytics cookie applies at the top level domain level. So if they go between subdomains, they're going to have the same session, same kind of user ID, and they'll be seen as one person. But if it's different domains across a lot of different properties, that might be an issue. As I mentioned, I haven't worked with it myself, but there is an enhanced e-commerce one that allows you to track information of like what products are people viewing, what are they adding to their cart, some of the interactions of like are they actually checking out through the cart and purchasing things or getting a refund or some things like that. So that allows you to track very, very targeted information. And then one of the ones that I saw very recently was AutoTrack, which is more around those interactive components. So it has some plugins. This is an extra JavaScript that you have to add to your site, but it is built and maintained by the Google Analytics team. And it tracks some events like are people clicking off your sites to external links, or that has that page scroll one to see like what is the to track an event of someone has scrolled down the page by a certain threshold, and ultimately what is the furthest they've scrolled down the page to build a metric out of that. So there's a few useful things for that that kind of you might want to add into your website. A couple things to keep in mind. For usage limits for free accounts, it's 10 million hits per month. So if you are adding events tracking to your website, it's going to increase and you might hit the limit. You can pay to increase that 10 million if you have a really busy site. The one that I think is probably more relevant is that 500 hits per session. From the documentation is that you can't pay to increase that. So if you have a very interactive website that people are doing a lot of events or like interactions with and you want to track that, you'll have to be mindful of how many things you're tracking, because that's going to affect performance. It's sending data every time you do that. It tries to do it asynchronously in the background, but that is going to affect the performance of the browser. But as well as it's just, once you hit that threshold, Google Analytics is just going to go, okay, I'm not going to track anything more for this session. And then you're going to start losing information. A new session is created after 30 minutes of inactivity. So if a user doesn't interact with your site, comes back an hour later, it's going to be a new session. That 500 count starts over. So if you have a highly interactive website, you can configure that to say if a user doesn't touch the website for 5 minutes, count it as a new session or a new interaction. Or if, for example, it's something that someone's going to interact with very slowly in small amounts over a long amount of time, I think you can increase it up to 4 hours. But again, you're more likely to hit that limit if you are tracking very granular information. So to implement this, I wrote a new module. This is exclusively for Drupal 8. Namespace is drupal.org/project/GA. A couple features that I think are pretty important for doing it, but the question is definitely why write a new module, why use this new module. The Google Analytics module available in Drupal 7 had 300,000 people who were using it successfully. There's a few reasons that I wrote it. The big one is going on to Drupal 8 is making use of object-oriented structures. I really didn't want to have another configuration through a messy array, an untyped array. It's prone to mistakes. It's hard to debug if something goes wrong. So I wanted to make sure that it was really intuitive, that when you were interacting with it, you were using data typing objects. It should give you helpful exception messages if something goes wrong. You should be able to handle those if something kind of breaks, and hopefully be able to fix it proactively. The other thing, the module used to be under the GACSB namespace. One of the things that I think is really important going forward is not using inline JavaScript so that you can prevent cross-site scripting attacks. And I want to make sure that this module doesn't make use of inline JavaScript so that you can make use of that feature. And the Google_Analytics module, it's ported to Drupal 8. There's a lot of sites using it already, but it relies on inline JavaScript, and the maintainer is adamant about retaining that. So I think for kind of looking forward in what websites should be adopting these sort of features for security around content security policy, the module enables you to do that when you're ready to do it if it's not on your radar yet. For site builders, I wanted to make sure it was very configurable. I don't want to make any assumptions about what you're doing on your website, so every single feature that it does to send information or track information, you can completely turn it off. So if you want to have, another module that takes over a particular component of it, you're not fighting about altering information between modules. Each one can target exactly what it needs to do and not step on each other's toes. And then the big feature, so for example, on that product website with all of those nodes, when tracking those dimensions, when a user is viewing every different node, you need to search through kind of a different hierarchy to see, like, okay, well, I need to go up the parent 2 chain to get the categories. Or I need to load information from a particular field that changes every time. So that needed to be very programmatic. And the previous Google Analytics module didn't actually have a hook to allow you to define those things or alter those things. So from the ground up, I wanted to make sure that it was really easy as a developer to say, I need to pull out this information and expose it to Google Analytics. So the base configuration of the module is pretty similar to the previous one. The breakdown of the module kind of comes out here is that there's an API behind the scenes for the programmatic component, and then this configuration is just a default implementation of using that API. So that first checkbox is allowing you to go, I don't like what this module does at all, I want to re-implement everything myself, turn off all of its behavior. And then every other item, it might seem kind of weird at first, but that tracking ID isn't even required here, just in case you have something else requiring it. So I've seen some websites where they were tracking, identical code between different websites, but they were, serving different needs, and it was actually kind of each site was swapping out that property ID through settings, through kind of some sort of function that was altering it, so it doesn't make sense to define that in configuration when it might change per site. So that's not required. And then, so that it allows you to enable any of those default plugins that are built in to Google Analytics. It allows you to kind of limit your tracking to say if someone's logged in as an administrator, their hits aren't meaningful, you can turn it off for them. And then the privacy ones are just built-in ones to Google Analytics right now, where you can say, I don't want to track someone's full IP address, and sort of marginally anonymize it.
So what are your thoughts on do not track then? Because that's a big problem with the old Google Analytics module. It only does do not track for authenticated users, not the anonymous users. So are you doing anything with that, or no?
The module right now doesn't handle do not track.
Okay. There's not an easy way to wrap it in something?
It depends on your needs. I think kind of like on the technical side it's possible, and I still have to look into it for compatibility with like cookie policy, GDPR. So that's something that I need to look into, because there are existing modules that implement those pop-ups and those sorts of things. That the module should be able to handle that, but kind of doesn't currently, because I've not had to take care of it myself.
Oh, that's cool. I've just had to, we have one site where we're sharing responsibility, and so that one, they don't want to have any of the modules in there, so it's just, I can hard code that solution in there, but we want to be able to use a module because there's some more, it's less coding for me, so, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So as a site builder, same as with the previous module, is that you can use tokens to define things. One limitation on this right now is that this only allows you to do kind of globally accessible properties. So things that are inherent to your site, which would be a little weird because every page on your site is going to have the same kind of site configuration. But any user information you can pull out. So here it's pulling out kind of the roles of the current user on the website, because that's available globally. The limitation is that it can't pull out any entity information yet. So if you're viewing a node, it can't pull out the node's title and put it into a dimension. The big thing for that is that I think that should be configured on the node level. Each node should have a separate screen to configure this, to say what tokens it needs, because if you're pulling out the title of a node, or its taxonomy as its category, or a related node entity, you're going to need a different token for each one of those, and having one global screen doesn't support that. So getting into the more programmatic aspect of it, when you're tracking information with Google Analytics, there's basically 4 major commands. Create just sets up that API key to say what property is this being tracked to. Require allows you to enable any additional plugins. Set is where you provide that dimension information or metric information to categorize anything on the website. And then finally it's send. Usually the first send that you do is that page view, to say someone is viewed this page, and then events, user timings, and then there's also another custom one for tracking social interactions. If someone's shared it on Facebook or tweeted it, those are all just kind of particular types of send events. And these have that defined order. If you don't add your set command until after the send, anything that you send isn't going to include it. So kind of that order is important. So on the JavaScript side, there's good Google documentation around each of these commands. It's one global method. You send it the command, and then you send it the arguments. This is a very dynamic function. Most of them accept basically a number of strings as an argument, and then the final one is an object for additional, usually optional configuration. But you can send everything in that single object. So translated to PHP, I wanted to kind of match this structure. It's a little bit different, where each command instead is the name of an object, but the arguments are going to match up to what you do in JavaScript. So you should be able, to look at the documentation for Google Analytics and for exactly what you need to do for implementing in this module. So quickly flip through just kind of the mapping here. So create, to set up your property, that happens kind of automatically by the module if you enable its default features. Requiring plugins, it's not in the example here, but many of them will have additional configuration that you provide in the fields object. That's going to vary between each particular one. So for example, the linker one, you need to provide it a list of domains of what you're going to be tracking across, so it knows what links on your site to alter to make use of it. Dimensions, so these are a set command and a generic one, where you're just providing the name of it and the value. This is one where I do want to provide a targeted class. It's not in the module yet, where you just say I want to create a new dimension. The index of it is 1, then it can actually check that you're providing a valid integer and the value. Same with metrics. It's a generic set, but for metrics they have to be numeric. They can be either an integer or a floating point number if you want to track dollars and cents or something like that. But on the Drupal side, this should be able to validate with that command, like with a dedicated metric command. You should be able to validate when you're putting information in that you're giving it the right types, as opposed to going to the front end, providing it useless data, and having Google Analytics not track what you want and not even be aware of it. And then there's the send command. So these are ones that do have targeted classes, because for a page view, you're usually not providing any extra information. You can alter things like the title that gets tracked in Analytics. So if you have additional information in the title of your page, you can strip that out so that the Analytics reports are a little bit easier to view. Or if you need to change the URLs. That's somewhat uncommon, but for example, if you have a more dynamic front-end application where it's altering the URLs that might not be particularly meaningful, or if it's putting things into kind of the hash attribute, those don't get tracked as a page view. So you can send page view events with kind of the very specific URL that makes sense to your JavaScript application in that case. Similarly, for events, dedicated class, you're sending in a few different properties. The first two are required. You're sending it like what the person is interacting with it and then what their action is. And then the last one is optional. So here it's just they're interacting with this particular video. Just another way to categorize those events ultimately. Similar with user timings, here you're just sending a value. It's the number of milliseconds for an item. And then social events, here's an example of using that fields object. There isn't a dedicated class for this, so you're just using the generic send object. It's a social command, and then you're providing social network, social action, social target. Those are defined by the Google Analytics API. These are just, you set them on the PHP side, they're just passed through in kind of JSON serialized object to be sent to Google Analytics. So to actually implement this, on kind of the server side, when you're pulling information out of Drupal itself, instead of a hook, since this is using kind of Drupal 8 native things, it's using the Symfony events. So you need to define an event subscriber by taking a service with the event subscriber name. You can provide in any arguments. Probably the most common one is going to be the root match. That's going to allow you to pull out what entity are they viewing on this page, or any other arguments that are provided. So defining the class, you're registering it to listen to an event. This gives you a bunch of flexibility over hooks as well. You can have multiple classes that are event subscribers in your module. You can break down how the functionality goes into different methods. You can define what order that they need to be. It's not so relevant to this module, but it's possible. So here I'm defining two different methods to say I want to handle nodes and taxonomy a little bit differently. And then there's just the constructor to say I'm pulling in that root match to be able to make use of it. And then for setting node dimensions for this method, the first thing it does is say, like, am I on a URL where I have a node as an argument? If not, don't do anything. So this is pulling information out from the umami profile to say some content has a field of, recipe content has a category field. I want to pull out the related taxonomy term and save that in a or for a recipe it has a difficulty, which is a direct property on the recipe itself, or for a particular bundle type. On the umami profile, the author isn't meaningful on recipes, but it is for articles. So here I want to pull out the author information to say what's the most popular author on my website. How are they doing over time for reads or information. And then again, you can have a separate method to pull out, am I looking on a page that has a taxonomy term and reading those things. As I mentioned before, the order that those commands are set and sent to Google is important, that you need that create happening first, you need the send events to be happening at the end. Behind the scenes, each of these commands has kind of a default priority behind it, and so the module can automatically sort those according to that criteria. In most cases, you don't need to alter it, but if you really do need to, there is a parameter to each of these objects to say, I have a dimension that I don't want on the page view, but I do want to have it later to apply to any events that happen on the page. So that's customizable, but it's hidden because it's probably not something that most people are going to need to make use of. And then on the front-end side, you're going to need to implement a library. You need to have the dependency, the analytics library of the module itself, because that's going to initialize kind of the command queue is an array of stuff that gets sent to Google Analytics and the function that actually handles that. And then I'm relying on jQuery here just as I want to do some event handling and use the jQuery listeners. So in the file itself, here's an example of interacting to video events. I'm just binding an event listener that any video on the page, when someone hits the play button on it, I want to send an event. So it's going to be, the category is video, what type of thing I'm interacting with, their action on it, whether they're playing it, pausing it, making it full screen, and then pulling out some information. This is kind of use case specific, but I'm assuming that the video tag has an ID so that I can pull out kind of a hash of whatever video it is, or videos are more complex. You can't just pull out the source, but that's kind of the idea, so that you could actually break it down to which videos people are most interacting with or viewing. Another one that on the media website, it actually tracks, is someone viewing this video 10%, 50% of the way through, 90%, so that you can actually track engagement of like how many people are actually continuing through on the video versus watching the first 10 seconds and disappearing. And then kind of for more that interactive one on the API side, so someone hits a button, they want to refresh information on the page, capturing the date, sending a request to the API to get the resource. When the resource returns, capturing that timestamp, doing a rendering based on that data, capturing a timestamp again, and then sending that information off. These are probably small pieces of information, but I would recommend whenever possible kind of delaying these analytic sends to whenever kind of the interactive pieces for a user are done, so that it's not impacting, okay, the pages or the widget is taking incrementally longer to send because I'm sending off a whole bunch of data and actions first. They should be asynchronous, they shouldn't impact that, but better to delay it so that you're not dealing with that. One of the other things that you could do is just put it inside a set timeout to make sure that it's kind of queued later after every other execution is finished. One of the other interactions that is important, a lot of people want to track outbound links, or more importantly, as I mentioned, tracking is someone looking at a PDF. They want to download the file. One of the challenges is that PDF doesn't run analytics. You don't get a hit when someone views that file. So what you need to do on your website is when someone clicks that link, detect, here it's checking, is this a external URL, or you could detect, is this a .pdf URL? And then you need to track that on the page of the link, send that information before the browser gets to the next page. The challenge is Google Analytics by default tracks by using images. It embeds an image on the page with parameters in the URL with all of that extra information. The problem is when you click on a new link, the browser goes, oh, I'm going somewhere else, I'm going to stop loading things on the page. So it's not going to actually track that. So here there's this transport using a beacon. So that is telling the browser to send this request, don't expect any response, do it asynchronously, and do it even if someone navigates away from the page. It's generally built around tracking. The downside of that is for each of these events is that you can do things like after the analytics, you know that the analytics have been tracked and then you want to do something else, and you can't respond to that. Beacon is only supported in newer browsers, but that's like probably most anything someone's going to be using today. As far as I know, like Internet Explorer 9 doesn't. So if you have a lot of old browsers, you might have to use another method. And that's to use this hit callback. So here, instead of using that beacon, it's saying when someone clicks on a link, don't do the default navigate somewhere else, track that in analytics, and then allow them to go to that web page. The downside of this is that it does slow that interactions. You are waiting for this 100 millisecond response to go to Google and come back to you, and then act on it. So it can make behavior sluggish if you are tracking a lot of items like this. So like I said, this is pretty common especially for tracking file downloads like PDFs, or form submissions. So for example, that white paper download, they had a form, they had to fill it out, it sent them to the complete page where then they had a link. If you wanted to track an event of, hey, I submitted this form, you need to do this method as well to say, okay, it's been tracked, now I can kind of actually submit that data so that they move on the flow and go to the next page. So the end result, like what do you get after you're tracking this information? So within Google Analytics, you can configure custom reports based on any of those dimensions. So here's an example of the configuration for that media website where I want to break down what show, season, episode are people viewing and getting information for. So pulling out page views based on those categories. And there's actually different levels so that someone can look at I don't know how useful this is for the people actually looking at it, but which season is most popular for each one, and then which episode. And then you can target this as well in different ways to compare how episodes are doing over time for a particular show. So this report it just results in a table. Some of the other custom reports give you different graphs of how things are doing over time. So this is the reports from about this time last year, where you can see that the AMI This Week show, the latest episode, quite clearly has the largest traffic, kind of double, but you can see that people are still going back and looking at older episodes of the series quite significantly. This is showing page views. You can do similar reports for things like events for how people are viewing and interacting with the video content on the website. So this is just basically a way of very quickly pulling out this information as opposed to having to parse out URLs and filter it and do things after the fact. And it's very easy to link different people to these reports with information that is most relevant to them. You could even filter this to say, like, I want to have the brand manager for this particular show only gets a report that shows their show, and have a report specifically for them that filters it down on that level. And then this is that event tracking. As I mentioned, it records when someone's viewed the video 10% of the way through, 25% of the way through. The chart here isn't as helpful because it's just like the total number of any events that someone is sending to the website. But the table is showing that, I think like half of the people are getting past 75% of the video. So that's something that you can pull in information and make use of. Events as well give you kind of this interactive thing of like what's the flow of someone doing these things. So this is for the video player, so it's pretty linear. If someone views it 10%, then 25%, then 50%. But for more interactive component like that chart, or you have a fancy front-end application, you can see like what is the actual path that people are going through to interact with the website. And where are they dropping off at particular points. So I don't have an explanation why everyone wants to do full screen first on this video, but that's an interesting point that apparently, however this analytics is getting tracked, or users are interacting with the website, they hit the full screen button and then apparently they disappear. So that can maybe expose user behavior that you might want to be able to better enable or support people where they might be having troubles on the site. And then performance, this is the built-in performance report. The chart is a little deceptive because those two lines are on completely different scales, but this is tracking, what's the average server response time, how long is it taking Drupal to serve me this page versus how long is it taking the browser to render this page. So this report, Varnish is serving the page pretty quickly in 150 milliseconds, but the page load time, it's a lot of media or whatever, it's taking 3 seconds. It's something we probably want to optimize and monitor over time. And then you get a similar number for the user timings. This is from that issue tracking website for Drupal. Gives a little peak here at about 300 seconds, which probably indicates that API is timing out. So I can actually, in my Google Analytics platform, see that there's probably a problem, either with the API or with my site's use of it, and it's having issues. And then as well, it's pulling out information between different API requests that it's doing. I can see that a few API requests are doing perfectly fine. They're responding in half a second or so, but a couple of them have spiked to take longer. Like that release one is actually using the Drupal.org API, so I know it generally takes longer. I could dive into that and say over time, is it responding kind of consistently time-wise? All right, that's all my content. Any questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.